It's time to cut through the BS and talk about graphics card value based on real-world prices. You've seen the reviews, you know how the latest GPUs stack up based on the MSRP, and you also know how those MSRPs are basically fake in many instances. In most regions around the world, you just can't walk into a store and buy a card for the price that AMD and Nvidia advertised, making those prices irrelevant, at least for now, while the market is all kinds of effed up. So with that in mind, we need to talk about which graphics cards are the best and how they compare based on realistic, real-world prices we're seeing in the market today. And that's exactly what I'll be doing in this video. I'll be looking at real pricing in multiple different regions to properly compare the GeForce 50 series and Radeon RX 9000 series both to each other and prices that you could have paid for graphics cards not too long ago. Because yeah, sure, these companies can advertise prices to get better reviews and then not deliver those prices thinking everyone would just forget about a blatant bait and switch. Well, not us, because we continually evaluate the market and it's safe to say we're not happy with what we've found. Analyzing pricing at the moment is more tricky than normal because the vast majority of models you just can't buy at all. So if we made a video based on current prices for in-stock models, it would be a pretty boring video with just a handful of comparisons. But it's not like graphics cards aren't being sold at all. Retailers are selling models, but are doing so almost as soon as they arrive. The major complaint we've seen from you guys relating to this is that these restocks virtually never contain graphics cards priced at the MSRP. They're always overpriced mid-range or premium models, occasionally with even higher prices than the last restock. Anything with an even remotely reasonable price sells out instantly, and even cards I would consider as not reasonable get sold straight away too. To factor this problem into our value discussion, we're going to look at graphics card offerings in a unique way. Basically, I've looked at the lineups from each company and their list prices at major retailers. I've discarded the lowest model entirely from price evaluation, as in many situations those cards just don't exist or aren't being restocked in reasonable quantities. Then I've taken some data points from the rest of the lineup. The model up from the base model becomes our baseline real price for that graphics card. In a normal market, these slightly upgraded models are listed with a small premium over the MSRP, usually 5% or so, but the market is anything but normal right now, so the data will be quite telling. The second data point I'm looking at is the price for a premium GPU, so the most expensive card in the lineup with the exception of liquid-cooled models, which I haven't considered. Normally these cards would be 10 to 15% over the MSRP, but in a heavily supply-constrained market, the reason why this data point matters is it could represent the price you'll have to pay if GPU makers decide to only supply premium models instead of lower-priced cards. After all, if an AIB can only produce, say, 100 RTX 5090s and they know all of them will sell out instantly, why would they make anything but the most expensive GPU in their lineup? And we're certainly seeing resupplies being heavily biased towards the premium models. As an example, this is the RTX 5070 Ti lineup from MSI in Australia. We're discarding the price of the Shadow 3X OC model as it's an unrealistic, unsupplied MSRP card. The next model up is the Ventus 3X OC, which is factored into our baseline real price. Then we're also noting the price of the Vanguard SoC as it's the premium model. We do the same for all the other AIBs and average together the prices for the model up cards and average together all the prices for the premium cards, which goes into our cost per frame graphs. For older GPUs in the GeForce 40 and Radeon RX 7000 series, we're using real-world pricing for these cards prior to stock drying up at the end of 2024. As we explained in our previous GPU pricing video, prior generation models were discontinued earlier than they should have been in anticipation of GPU launches that were ultimately pushed back. This cleared out the market and caused prices to rise for remaining stock. So the prices for those few remaining cards at retailers today are typically not a fair representation of what those cards cost throughout their lifespan because they're charging more for them. We want to know how the real price of new models compares to the real price of previous models when you could buy them, so that Nvidia and AMD can't get away with just raising prices on everything right before launching disgustingly overpriced new models. As a quick refresher, this is what the lineups should look like based on the MSRP. The Radeon RX 9070 XT should be offering 19% lower cost per frame than the GeForce RTX 5070 Ti at 4K. The RX 9070 should be 8% cheaper per frame than the RTX 5070. The RTX 5080 should be 6% cheaper per frame than the RTX 4080 Super, and so on. Those margins do change a bit at 1440p compared to 4K. Here, for example, the RX 9070 XT shrinks to just a 15% reduction in cost per frame compared to the 5070 Ti, but generally that still sees the Radeon model in a solid position. Now let's take a look at real pricing for the model up in each lineup, starting with the 4K data in the US market. For the latest generation of cards, this is based on list prices at Newegg. As we can see, many models drastically increase in price. The RTX 5080 becomes a $1,350 GPU, the RTX 5070 Ti increases to $900, the 5070 jumps to $660, and AMD's cards aren't immune either. The 9070 XT is basically a $750 card, and the 9070 basically a $670 card under the pricing evaluation system I described earlier. So how does this affect value? Well, directly comparing current generation models, it basically maintains the status quo. At 4K, the RX 9070 XT is 16% cheaper per frame than the 5070 Ti using realistic pricing, as both models are effectively $150 over the MSRP right now. We see similar with the 9070 versus 5070, as right now both cards are still the same sort of price. Where the comparison really stings is looking at current generation models versus the prices you could have paid for the previous generation throughout most of last year. The RX 9070 XT, for example, basically ends up the same value as the 7900 XT, which was regularly available for around $700 US. And for NVIDIA GPUs, it's even worse, because the 5070 Ti goes from being slightly better value than the 4070 Ti Super to being 5% more expensive per frame. The RTX 5080 is a whopping 30% more expensive per frame than the 4080 Super, slotting in even worse than the RTX 4080 for value, making it a truly terrible purchase in the current market. And good luck if you're a 1440p gamer. The RTX 5080 here is 35% more expensive per frame than the RTX 4080 Super's typical 2024 price. The RX 9070 XT is also quite poor value, as it's unable to offer a next generation experience due to 22% higher cost per frame than the RX 7800 XT and 5% higher cost per frame than the 7900 XT. At the MSRP, the 9070 XT offers better value than both of these last-gen models. And looking at real prices, there's just a 12% discount per frame relative to the RTX 5070 Ti, which is quite a slim margin. Things change if we look at the worst-case scenario for the GPU market, but mostly just when comparing current models to older models. The same sorts of margins are maintained here between AMD and NVIDIA. Under premium pricing, a 9070 XT is 17% cheaper per frame than a 5070 Ti, compared to 16% using model up pricing and 19% at the MSRP. But in general, you don't want to pay these prices because a 9070 XT is 4% more expensive per frame than a 7900 XT, the 5070 Ti is 13% more expensive than this 4070 Ti Super, and the 5080 is a whopping 41% more expensive than the 4080 Super, presenting worse value than the RTX 4090. You are being screwed majorly if the only stock available is a premium model. These cards simply shouldn't be bought or really even exist at the list prices we're seeing today. Of course, the United States is just one side of the story. The dynamics at play can be totally different in other regions, so let's look at our home region of Australia. I looked at real list pricing for each lineup at PCK, and ScorpTech to create these average prices. Basically, new GPUs are a terrible deal in Australia, especially if you want a high-end NVIDIA GPU. Even for just the tier above the base model RTX 5080, we're faced with spending 2,550 Australian dollars, making it worse value than the going price for RTX 4090s in the middle part of 2024. The company that has benefited the most is AMD. The RX 9070 XT, in a direct comparison to the RTX 5070 Ti, ends up offering 24% lower cost per frame. So at least here in Australia, the Radeon card is better value than it is in the United States, looking at realistic prices. I think this is why we're starting to see RTX 5070 Ti's come back into stock and sit on shelves at $1,700 or more, because even $1,700 isn't an overly attractive price. What's interesting here is in the battle between the RTX 5070 and RX 9070, we're seeing much more availability than the other cards, so I've listed the cheapest available price for each model here. The 5070 is available at its MSRP of 1,110 Australian dollars, which is a poor deal in general, and the RX 9070 at a similar sort of price actually ends up offering better value than the typical RX 9070 XT price. It's 7% cheaper per frame, though this margin will evaporate if the 9070 XT comes back into stock over time at prices closer to the MSRP, as the 9070 is quite close to MSRP here with little room to move. While these comparisons between current models are nice, pricing is pretty awful compared to what graphics cards used to cost in the previous generation. Here in Australia, the 9070 XT is 13% more expensive per frame than the RX 7900 XT, which you could find for as low as $1,100, but regularly between $1,100 and $1,200 as recently as January. Really, the 9070 XT should be priced below $1,000 to make sense. Even the better priced RX 9070 is still worse value than the 7900 XT, and of course we're talking about raster performance here, we're not factoring in other elements like ray tracing and FSR4. The Nvidia side of things is even worse. A realistic price for the RTX 5070 Ti makes it 27% more costly per frame than the RTX 4070 Ti Super, which you could regularly purchase for around 1,300 Australian dollars in 2024. Remember, this card should actually be cheaper than the 4070 Ti Super going off a USD MSRP comparison, but even considering changes in exchange rates, the 5070 Ti should be more like a $1,300 model here, not nearly $1,800. Let's not even talk about the RTX 5090. When looking at the price for premium models, things get even crazier, especially for those high-end GeForce cards, which make absolutely no sense. Who is spending nearly 6,000 Australian dollars on an RTX 5090? That's just ludicrous. The RX 9070 XT ends up 26% cheaper per frame than the 5070 Ti, so Radeon cards are still in a good position locally, even if only the most expensive listings see resupplies. That's of course a good position for the current market. You're still getting screwed in comparison to the 7000 series. Lastly, a look at the European market, or at least part of it. The data here is based off German retailers. We could have looked at many more countries, but you'll get the picture from just one. Things are looking pretty rough for our European friends, especially if you're interested in a GeForce 50 series GPU, where prices are woefully expensive. The model up pricing for the RTX 5070 Ti is €1,040, making it 11% more expensive per frame than the RTX 4070 Ti Super, which in the mid to late parts of 2024 could be purchased for just €860. Essentially, Germans here are getting screwed more with the 5070 Ti pricing than Americans, but aren't getting screwed quite as hard as Australians. We see similar price trends to other regions when looking at the 5080 and 5090, which are extremely overpriced. In both circumstances, these cards are much worse value than the 4080 Super and 4090 respectively. The RX 9070 XT is 12% more costly per frame than the RX 7900 XT's typical asking price from just a few months ago, which again is quite similar to what the Australian market is dealing with. As for the RTX 5070 and RX 9070, we are starting to see similar trends in Germany as in Australia, where these models actually are available at a price somewhere between the MSRP and the listed price for the next model up. Both of these cards, with a $550 US MSRP, should be priced at €600 on the German market, but are currently available for around €100 above that. This makes them poor value compared to previous generation models. The RTX 5070, for example, is 10% more costly per frame than the RTX 4070 Super, but at least unlike the other cards, they actually can be purchased right now. The question then becomes which card is offering the best value. Right now, the RX 9070 is edging out the listed model up price for the RX 9070 XT with a 6% reduction in cost per frame. I wouldn't say this makes it a must buy considering it's still worse value than previous generation models, but it's 5% cheaper per frame than the RTX 5070 and 22% cheaper per frame than the RTX 5070 Ti. Meanwhile, the RX 9070 XT, were it available at this price, would be 17% cheaper per frame than the 5070 Ti. If AIBs only supply premium models, the market looks a bit different, with new cards presenting even worse value than last-gen models. The RTX 5080, for example, ends up 44% more costly per frame than the RTX 4080 Super, and right now, if you actually want to buy a 5080 that's in stock, you'll be paying near this price, so a very bad situation. The RX 9070 XT ends up the best value new generation model at 19% cheaper cost per frame than the RTX 5070 Ti. Overall, when attempting to assess the graphics card market based on real prices, things are looking pretty dire right now. Whether we look at the United States, Australia, or Germany, the typical price of listed models makes new generation graphics cards worse value than previous generation cards. Of course, in most situations, you can't buy either current or previous gen models right now, but looking at prices for pretty basic AIB cards and comparing that to what GPU prices looked like just 6 months ago, buyers are getting screwed when grabbing stock as it arrives at retailers. This is because of a larger than usual gulf between base model cards listed at the MSRP and the next tier up in an AIB's lineup. In previous years, it's typical to pay about 5% more for a second tier card. So for a GPU with a $750 MSRP, the next model above the base model would be around $790. Instead, we're seeing more like a 20% premium this time around, and those are the models being supplied. And if it's not those cards, it's an even more expensive model. Really, base model cards are the only models worth buying if you want to get a good deal relative to the 2024 graphics card market. The MSRP is the only price that makes sense. You could maybe justify a 5% premium, for example, a $790 RTX 5070 Ti would still be slightly better value than the RTX 4070 Ti Super, about 8% cheaper per frame. But at a 20% premium over the MSRP, you can forget about it. You're getting absolutely rolled at that sort of price and are much better off waiting for the market to settle. What's interesting is that inflated GPU prices seem to have impacted Nvidia and AMD roughly equally in the market segments where they compete against each other. One of the things we heard about pre-launch is how AMD's Radeon RX 9070 XT price of $600 US is so attractive compared to the RTX 5070 Ti that was selling for $900 at the time, and how we as reviewers shouldn't be comparing these models at their listed MSRP because Nvidia's advertised price is fake and AMD's is real. However, we're coming up to 2 weeks after the 9070 XT launch, and if we compare similar models in the respective lineups, so excluding non-existent base MSRP cards, we find similar differences in value. At the MSRP, the 9070 XT is 19% cheaper per frame than the 5070 Ti. But real prices right now have the 9070 XT as 16% cheaper per frame in the US, because both the 9070 XT and 5070 Ti listings have risen by a similar dollar amount. In Germany, the 9070 XT was 17% cheaper per frame, and Australia benefited a bit more with a 24% discount per frame. Had the 9070 XT actually stayed at $600 like some people thought it would, while the 5070 Ti remained at $900, it would be offering a 32% discount per frame, but that simply hasn't materialized. Of course, I want to make it clear that we're in a very volatile GPU market at the moment with limited supply, highly inflated prices, and lots of issues and manipulation throughout the supply chain. What we're showing here in terms of GPU value may not be the case in a few weeks if and when supply starts to increase and there's more competition among GPUs actually in stock. Increasing supply and flooding the market is the path to lower GPU prices, and there are plenty of reasons why this should happen. Chiefly, AMD needs to build market share by pumping out their in-demand cards and getting them into the hands of gamers. I'm not going to say it will happen, just that if companies are doing things in a way that actually benefits them, then it should happen because AMD should be increasing competition in that part of the market. On top of this, it's important to be reminded that it's normal for graphics cards to sell out around the launch. This has happened many times before, and usually we see things begin to settle after a month or two. That certainly hasn't happened with the RTX 5090, but we are seeing some signs of it with other models. Here in Australia, for example, you can buy an RTX 5080, 5070 Ti, 5070, and RX 9070 right now if you want to. Yes, most of these are extremely expensive, price gouging special edition models instead of base MSRP cards. And we're certainly concerned about how much more of a premium are being charged for those models this time around than in previous situations when cards would sell out around the time of launch. But a week or two ago, you couldn't even buy the overpriced models. Once the overpriced cards start sitting on shelves, then you'll start to see mid-range cards sit on shelves. Then finally we should work our way to availability of the reasonable cards. At least that's how the market should work. Whether or not it actually works that way is yet to be seen. Anyway, that's it for now. Enough of a chat about graphics card pricing and graphics card value based on where things are at the moment, where things are really crazy. But for people that are actually trying to buy graphics cards right now, I thought it's probably interesting to have a look at how much you're getting screwed right now if you go to a retailer and you buy one of those extremely expensive premium models. The answer is you're definitely getting screwed and you should definitely wait. So yeah, that does it for this one. We'll be tracking GPU pricing pretty closely over the next couple of months to make sure the market does settle in the way that it should be settling. And then we'll go back and we'll look at value again to see what's the real price of the 5070 Ti when they're in stock, what's the real price of the 9070 XT and all the other models that will be available on the market. So subscribe to Hardware Unboxed for more content like that in the coming months. If you want to support the channel directly, we have our Patreon account. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you'll gain access to some pretty cool benefits, Discord community, monthly live streams, BTS content, plenty of good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.